All right, pumpkin mug, candy out of my teeth, we are good. Okay, so if you ever have a conversation with someone and around toffee apples or caramel apples or whatever, and they go, oh, I love those, I grew up with them, you're going to want to clarify what their interpretation of toffee or caramel apples mean, because it's going to completely change on first whether it's British or American, because you can use the same word but they actually mean different things. But yeah, like I started going down this rabbit hole and I was like, well, which one's correct? Or like not even which one's correct, which one came first? And of course I was trying to do this like linear, like somehow it's going to have a timeline. And I guess like history as well, things actually aren't nice and neat and tidy in a line. So I've actually mapped this like a family tree, and that makes a whole lot more sense, because while there are some origins, by the time you get to all the different alternatives, I'm not sure if you guys have ever done like your family history and your genealogy, but if you look, you know, you'll have like the next one or two right at the top, and by the time you get down to you, it's like, in your generation, it's like bleh. Like there's just so many people, and that's what looking at the toffee apple family tree kind of looks like. So I'm going to take you guys down the rabbit hole I went through, hopefully a little bit neater because my brain was just going pew. So toffee apples. All right, Dorothy Hartley, if you haven't heard her name before, she is or was a English food historian. Like she's sort of like your go-to when it comes to books on English food and like its history and so on. So she has said that toffee apples, so we are going to call them toffee apples from here out. First, they are British. That the origins of them came probably from the time of like the fairs of St. Bartholomew. Now, if you haven't heard of that fair before, it began in 1133 and the last fair was in 1855. So that is like a 700-year period going on that we're talking about. But somewhere in there, she thinks that the apples dipped in sugar would have been in the form of like apples being dipped in honey with beeswax. And that's probably where like the origin came from of these toffee apples. So you get that all the way through to like 1800s. And here's where I think we start to branch out a bit more. So it's really interesting because it comes down to the language and whether you're using common English words or sugar making words. And that's where the interpretation seems to change and shift. So let's start with toffee apple. So toffee in sugar making terms basically means a simple boiled syrup. That's it. Of course, toffee as a common English word also means like toffee, the candy. And that's usually a boiled sugar with a mix of sugar and dairy. So that's where you can have the same word, different meanings. Toffee apple, coming down. Definition of toffee, splitting off. If you're looking at toffee as like the simple boiled syrup, this is really where you see that real, what the British will call a toffee apple. So one book I came across talked about toffee apples really coming about in like the early 1900s. I'm going to say maybe the 1800s instead. But really it's apples dipped in sugar, like a sugar syrup that's made of like sugar, water, cream of tartar or vinegar, and also that red food coloring. So because a lot of British will go, oh, it's like a toffee apple's like the bright red apples. So that's that definition, and that's where a lot of people go, that's a toffee apple. However, I wanted to keep exploring because the apples described in the Night Circus, which is where this whole thing started about, was that the apples are dipped in caramel and that they're really dark and yet crisp and light and sweet. So I'm like, okay, let's keep looking. So if you go back to toffee being a simple boiled syrup, I came across another, it was a UK based cookbook, so it was an old cookbook, maybe early 1900s, and they described their toffee apples as dipping apples into caramel. So I'm like, wait, what? So caramel, again, definitions start splitting out. So caramel, again, means two different things, the same way toffee means two different things. So in sugar making terms, caramel is that last cooking stage of sugar. So you know, you've got like soft crack, hard crack, caramel. And that's where I'm going to call it browning the sugar. Some people describe it as burnt sugar because you're starting to get that dark amber color coming through. So that's really, I think when you go down that pathway, that's where you're finding what is described in the Night Circus. So it's caramel as a sugar stage. Caramel can also mean the candy. So caramel and toffee, even then, those two words are sometimes interchanged. They often have like butters and creams in. So, you know, you kind of look at that and go, yeah, probably someone along the way when someone said, oh, we made a toffee apple or whatever, and someone went, oh, toffee, as in toffee, the candy. So what's the chances that someone went and started making toffee apples, as in the candy toffee, or you dip it in caramel, and caramel people going, oh yeah, the caramel, the candy. So started doing it that way. So you can kind of see how, like, there's a few pathways you can go about, and it's not like any of them are wrong. It just goes to show how, you know, you can take one word and then the interpretation of it changes, and then it keeps evolving. And especially when you've got something, like even if we're taking it from the 1800s all the way through to now, that's a good chunk of time for interpretations to happen over and over and keep adapting and so on. I did want to touch on the American toffee apple, because I mean, I did do a search even just like online, and it's like, or the caramel apple, and like they have like a really hard set. It's like, nope, the toffee apple in America started in the 1930s. It was commercially created, and that's where it began. And I'm like, oh really? Because I did come across a cookbook and it's American Candy Making Cookbook from 1913, and they do make toffee apples, and it is toffee as the candy. 1930s, you probably did see toffee apples commercially being made, but that's not when they began being made actually in America. So I mean, this is it, like when you actually look at the history, you know, people were traveling back and forth. It's not like we were like one country and another. People immigrate across, you know, people have taken words, or they hear things and it comes across the pond to the US, and then it gets interpreted. So the candy apples in the US, just to round this one out, look, they are like the British toffee apples in that it's a sugar syrup of sugar, water, cream of tartar, red food coloring. But someone in the States obviously was playing around with more the cinnamon candies and went with that. So again, it spins out and it creates this other alternative. And yeah, and suddenly like that's the American candy apple. They are all their own thing in their own right. But yeah, they're all cousins in some shape or form. So that was my rabbit hole. So coming back to making the caramel apples, toffee apples, from the Night Circus. So the definition is helping me here. So the description of it being so dark it's almost black and saying it's dipped in caramel, that's telling me we are looking at caramel as a sugar syrup cooking stage. And also the fact that it's light and crisp is telling me we're not talking about like the real creamy, well, the caramel's made with cream. You really want that hard crack, and for it to be light, you need that simple boiled syrup. Like, sugar has changed, so obviously nowadays we reach for refined sugar, but that white sugar isn't the only sugar that people used to use. As I said, like, you know, they started with honey. There was a period of time where it seemed like treacle was the main sugar that was used for toffee apples in England. So Dorothy Hartley, I'm going to go back to her recipe and give that one a crack, because she makes it with treacle, brown sugar, butter, and vinegar. Which is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of like a little deviation between both types of toffee. So you've got your toffee, the common language, and toffee, your sugar boilers term. All right, so we are going to jump in and we're going to make the Night Circus's Victorian London, just so we're clear, caramel, toffee, apples. So we're going to start by melting the butter. So we're going to take 113 grams of butter, melt that down. Then we're going to pour in 3/4 of a cup of treacle. And then we're going to pour in 2 cups and a quarter of brown sugar. And when you're filling this cup, you're going to want to make sure it's really packed down. And then you're also going to add in a tablespoon of vinegar. So we are going to give that a stir. And you are going to stir that just until your sugar is really well combined with your butter. So at this point, we are just going to pop in our candy thermometer. You are not going to want to touch your candy after this point. You just need to let it bubble away. I put my stove on sort of a medium heat. So if you're going for that true caramel, you are going to want to cook it to 170 degrees Celsius or 338 degrees Fahrenheit. If you are not confident with cooking with sugar, or this is your first time, I would do it just a hard crack stage. It's going to still have that real dark color to it, so I wouldn't worry too much. Meanwhile, we're going to prep apples. So I'll be honest, I did test out whether having wax on these apples made a difference. I actually found it didn't, and I think it's just because maybe it's the consistency. I know everyone goes, oh, it's really difficult getting caramel to stick to apples, but I think whenever I've seen that, we're actually talking about making like the caramel candy, and that's, if you're going to make that type, then you're going to want to really make sure your wax is removed. When your caramel is complete and cooked, so I saw a tip somewhere about dipping your apples in the caramel sauce or the toffee sauce when you've let it cool just a little bit. Apparently it helps it stick. Whether that made a difference or not, I'm not sure. But basically you are going to stick some skewers into your apples. I had pre-done these, so I just used black gel food coloring, painted the sticks. I let them dry. If you don't have time to dry them overnight, just whack them in the oven just to dry out. Plunge those into your apples. So you can take one of your apples on its skewer, stick it into the boiled sugar syrup mixture, and give that a stir, like in a spin around, just so the apple's completely coated. I just let that dangle for just not even, 30 seconds, just so the excess comes off. That way you don't have so much of a gloopy base when you let them dry. At that certain point, I pop them onto a silicone mat. You can use just baking paper as well, and that way they can dry and they won't stick. Anything else, and the stuff will glue. Finish off all your apples, set those aside, and then I guess dive in. Okay, now that I've unglued my teeth, I just wanted to quickly, I guess, describe what it tasted like. If you were used to eating like the caramel candy apples or the red sugar syrup dipped apples, those are sweet. While these, I guess the treacle, but also the temperature that you cook it at, brings out a little bit more of like a bitterness that, well, you find that in treacle anyways. And even like bitter's not quite the right word, because I don't want to like put you guys off. But when you combine that with the sugar and the apple, it's just, I don't know, maybe a bit more of a refreshing sweet treat. But yes, very interesting, kind of cool, and it gives you a taste of Victorian London for Halloween.